Hi, my name is Kim Fountain, and I'll be doing your presentation today on the workplace gender divide. I use she, her, they, them pronouns, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Center on Halsted, which is the Midwest's largest LGBTQ community center. I've been working in the LGBTQ movement for about the past 24 years, which is a very long time, but I'm also a cultural anthropologist of identity-based violence. Today, we're going to be talking about moving beyond that binary and the gender divide in the workplace, and we're really talking about moving beyond our typical notions of male and female. So a lot of us will think about, for instance, payday equity, where that point in a year where women have to work to make the same amount that men worked the year prior. So we want to move beyond that, even though that's still important. We're going to be talking about transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, which I will shortened to TGNC and non-binary. We'll look at some numbers, and I have that T highlighted in blue there because a lot of the work around the gender divide in terms of workplace is done around trans identities and not as much around GNC and non-binary folks. It's a little harder to do those numbers. We're going to move on to reimagining some professionalism in the workforce and what that really means, and then start talking about being an ally. But first, I want you to try this exercise, and most of us can do this from at home. So if you can, just kind of clasp your hands together and look at which thumb is on top, right? And that kind of feels comfortable. Then I want you to unclasp your hands, put them back together again, and see, but this time with a different thumb on top, right? So if you can do that, for a lot of us, this feels a little awkward. That's not how we do it. It's not what we're accustomed to, and that's just change. And change can feel really awkward, and that's not a bad thing. But it is oftentimes uncomfortable, and we just have to work through that. So who are TGNC and non-binary folks? A little understanding will really go a long way when you're working with folks who may come out to you as TGNC or non-binary, or if you're TGNC and non-binary yourself, you may see a few things in this presentation that you can bring into your workplace. So who are we? People whose sex or gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. And what does that mean? It just basically usually means that a doctor will look at the external genitalia on an infant and say, this is a boy or this is a girl. And for trans, GNC, and non-binary folks, our sex or gender identity is different from that, birth assignment. And we also don't want to leave out cisgender folks. Most of the world is cisgender. Those are folks whose sex or gender identity is the same as that they were assigned at birth. So they feel that perfect alignment. Okay. What do we mean again by the assigned at birth and identity and expression? So Kate Bornstein, a great trans activist, had said that gender assignment happens when culture says that is what you are, whereas gender identity, right, answers the question, who am I, and what gender do I know I belong to? So it's adapted from her work. And once we figure out the gender we know we belong to, we start expressing it. Things like, our clothing, our hairstyle, how we walk, how we talk, all those kinds of things will signal to folks, this is the gender I'm projecting. We're still going to ask people what their gender identity is, but meeting folks halfway in terms of, asking is really important, and also allowing folks to completely express their gender identity. So some basic facts about non-binary folks, because people don't know a lot about non-binary people. So we're nothing new in the world. There's a lot of non-binary folks out there, and we basically have that gender identity that falls outside of male or female, meaning that we don't identify strictly as female or strictly as male. Some, but not all, binary folks will undergo medical processes to make their bodies more congruent with their gender identity. And some folks don't want to do that. They feel absolutely fine and aligned with their body, and that's okay also. We want to know, too, that most transgender folks, and this is where there's a little bit of a difference between trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming, a lot of trans folks are not non-binary, right? They actually decide that, when I'm going to go into the world, I am male or I am female. And so that is their identity, and we want to make certain that we respect that. Some non-binary folks will use their legal names, others won't. And there's not one single binary experience, just like there's not one single trans experience or cisgender experience. It's all pretty complicated, and what we're trying to get people really used to is asking and trying to figure out what works best for folks. So we look at some of our vocabulary around these identities in order to better understand, right? So a lot of companies have engaged in bringing in individuals to talk about the transgender experience, that oftentimes you'll hear words like male and female. In some countries like India, you'll hear third gender, trans or transgender. I have transgender male, female, and male to female highlighted in red there because we're moving away from that kind of thinking, because for trans folks, a lot of times you'll hear that they were assigned these genders at birth and they've never identified with them. So to say they've moved, for instance, from being female to male is actually misidentifying them, that they've always been female. It's everybody around them who was mistaken. So we're moving away from those terms, even though you might still hear them in use. And now we're talking even more, thanks to a lot of trans activism, we're talking about even more identities. We're looking at non-binary folks, agender folks, and androgyny has been around for a while. Remember David Bowie, right, or Prince. Folks who are gender queer or gender non-conforming. All of these words mean something a little different from each other, just looking at the richness of identity out there. And some pronoun use, because this is where people get a little confused. Some companies today are putting their pronouns into their signature lines at, in their emails, and that's a really great step. We're asking people not to use preferred pronouns. Instead, we're going to say just pronouns, or just put the pronouns in there. This is because pronouns are so deeply connected to our identity for a lot of folks. Some folks do not use pronouns, right? But for others, it's deeply connected. And we're saying that it's not that we prefer these pronouns, it's that these are our pronouns. So possible options around pronouns are, she, her, hers, he, him, his. You could use they, them, theirs. We've created our own also using things like words like thee, here, and here's. So, and again, other folks just may not want any pronouns. So you can just say, Jack went to the store and Jack brought home milk, something like that. So there are all kinds of pronouns out there. We're just going to ask folks what they want and understand that some people may want some pronouns in some situations and other pronouns in other situations. A lot of times this is a matter of safety and negotiating the world around us. So all of this leads to what's called gender authenticity, right? The right to express one's identity and orientation without fear of coercion to conform to gender stereotypes. That's what we really want, to bring our full authentic selves to the table. Because when people are free to do that, to be that truthful and genuine person, and it means that we can bring our whole selves, right, to everything we do, including our jobs, right? So that's so important. And what happens when things don't go quite right? Well, that's when you start hearing words like homophobia, biphobia, and heterosexism, this fear or sometimes hatred of folks who may be LGBTQ or bi or trans. And at the heart of all of this is misogyny, which is that fear or hatred of women. And it happens and is perpetuated both on individual and systemic levels. So this is important to understand. It's not just, most folks think about it in the interpersonal moment, right? When one person is mean to another person or oppressive to another person. But really what we have to think about when it comes to oppression is that we internalize it, which is why you get those higher rates of suicide in TGNC communities and in cisgender communities, because we've internalized all that hate. Interpersonally, that bias happens when you have like somebody in the workforce who continually misgenders one of their colleagues. And it also happens on that systemic level, so where culture really reinforces those gender norms, for instance, by having male and female restrooms, right, or having women's clothing, men's clothing, right? Those are cultural norms. And it happens then on the structural level when culture doesn't support, say, for instance, trans and non-binary folks, when we go to get services because we need something like maybe domestic or sexual violence services, and they're very gendered. So those structural moments really wear away in the road and, at our self-esteem and our self-worth, and then it sort of loops back around to that internalization. So you can see how that all fits together so that, hopefully that creates a picture of, it's not just that interpersonal relationship, that change has to happen on all of these levels for it to really stick. And this is a kind of a tough slide, but I really want people to understand that this is how oppression works in our society. You're seeing some of my cultural anthropology come in here. So you see this person in here, and what they've heard their entire lives are things like, you're disgusting, you're sick, you're not my child, you're, a sissy or a predator. They hear this, right? And that cyst could be the physical harm that we actually experience. And it could be a parent hurling insults at their kid and throwing them out of the house, or it could be the teacher who says, you're not supposed to be in this classroom, or there's something wrong with you, or, and then that ripples out to, again, that sort of individual moment saying, like, I deserve this and I can't tell anybody, or I'm afraid. And then that person's inner circle who knows this happened to this kid or this individual says, that could have been me. So maybe they distance themselves from that person, or they say, oh, they deserved it because they were so flamboyant, or they were so out, or they were so in people's faces about their gender identity, for instance, because, we shouldn't be doing that, and not really realizing that folks who are trans or GNC or non-binary experience cisgender privilege all the time, coming at us all the time. And, through that sort of media and social media and our peer groups and our faith-based communities, it's everywhere around us. And if we just happen to say it out in the world, we get in trouble for it, right? So, or the violence against us is justified. So that happens at an inner circle moment, and that ripples out to community. And the community, we get exhausted, or, we just try to get by, or we're on hypervigilance because feeling like constantly under attack. And so this is how it ripples it again into the world and, the individual in the world around us. So, know that is the burden that a lot of folks who are trans, GNC, and non-binary walk through the world. So let's look at some of the numbers. And the reason why we want to look at numbers is because whenever we talk about identity and rights, or the need to, create change, we're always looking at policy. And so if we're looking at policy, we're saying that when you have that lack of gender-specific policy, plus that lack of understanding around non-binary identity, what you end up with is that negative bias in the workplace. And so we have to really check out what this means in order to actually address it. So we'll start with setting the frame and setting this idea of who we are. So millennials by far are the most diverse generation in the workplace. In all of history, you haven't had more of a diverse group of folks. But by 2020 and by 2025, we'll represent 75% of the workforce. Half of these folks believe that gender runs along a spectrum, that it's not that binary male-female, that it is much more expansive than that. And that millennials are more than 2 times as likely to identify as LGBTQ and more likely to identify as non-binary or gender fluid than previous generations. And when they go to work, about 88% want to bring a work-life integration, which means that, so for instance, love cats. Cats are lovely, they're amazing. And if I wanted to go into my office and put cat pictures everywhere, that's blending my personal and professional life, right? And some people might not bat an eye at that. But if I brought in, my trans flag, or, something that signaled that I was non-binary, things like this, oftentimes that might be seen as too political or too disruptive in the workplace. But remember, millennials are looking for that work-life integration, so they're looking to bring that into the workspace. Now, another thing that you should know about, and this is, again, a lot of the data is on trans folks because you don't have as much on GNC and non-binary people at this moment. But this is pretty representative. So in the U.S., trans individuals are 4 times more likely to be in poverty than the general population, right? That risk is pretty high then. And 27% of trans workers reported being fired or not hired or denied a promotion in a survey that was done by the National Center for Transgender Equality. About 58% of Fortune 500 companies offer trans-inclusive benefits, which that's a good thing. It could be higher, but that's still better than it has been in the past. And then our unemployment rate is 3 times higher than national average, and about 3/4 of trans employees take steps to avoid mistreatment in the workplace, which means hiding who trans folks are or hiding some part of that identity so it doesn't get attacked in the workplace. So it's a pretty dire situation in the world for trans folks in poverty and work. And then to understand, too, that there's no federal law barring employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Some states have laws, which is really great. A few states say that you actually can't enforce non-discrimination, or you can't have non-discrimination laws at all, which is pretty tragic for our community in general. And what all of this means on this map here is showing that about half the LGBT population live in states that don't prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And that's really scary for a lot of these folks. And I understand that you might live in Illinois where the protection is great, right? But what if I get transferred for my job to Arizona or to Texas, right? Maybe that's going to be a little bit, more serious. And if I move to Arizona to Arkansas or Tennessee, it becomes even more prohibitive. So it's, we have a pretty mobile workforce nowadays. And so people might look at this map and say, phew, I'm in a good state. But no, that could change at any moment too. And I want you to know that equity isn't always about laws, right? Which is pretty good, because when you look at the way that the executive orders have been passed around protections, that they're roller coasters. So you might have an administration like the previous one that put in a lot of great protections, and then you have a current administration that takes away those protections. And so you might, be coming out at work during one of those great protected moments, and then 4 years later end up in a situation where now your job is threatened. So it's this kind of whiplash moment for a lot of millennials. But again, not all terrible. If you look at even what happens for lesbian, gay, bisexual employees, which is, again, a pretty good indicator of where the world is moving in terms of other forms of acceptance, that back in '96, only 4% of these companies had these non-discrimination policies. And by 2019, 91% did. So it's we're seeing a good trend toward equity, but still not there. So let's look at professionalism, because professionalism is often the place where a lot of trans, GNC, and non-binary people get in trouble or face discrimination, because this is where our gender expression is often most often called into question, or places where we run into some troubles on paperwork and things like this. We'll get there. But professionalism generally reflects a company's values, right? It creates that workplace culture. It will illuminate or erase certain identities, and oftentimes it's used to denote who can be trusted with, say, for instance, an assignment or not. And Jacob Tobias is a non-binary activist, and had this quote out there that I thought was particularly relevant. And Jacob said, "Professionalism is a funny term because it masquerades as neutral despite being loaded with immense oppression. As a concept, professionalism is racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, classist, imperialist, and so much more. And yet people act like professionalism is not political." Okay, so let's get into that a little bit. Think about expressing professionalism, right? These are things that often show up in an employee handbook, right? It talks about hair, clothing, shoes, facial hair, foods, how you speak, right? All of these end up being called into question when somebody's professionalism is being looked at. And think about this in terms of gender markers, okay? So professionalism in the employee handbook might say, appropriate hair is required, like hairstyles are required. And but if somebody who's perceived to be masculine or male identified walks in with long hair, they might be told that's not professional. Or if a woman shaves her head because that's what she thinks is, or gets a buzz cut or a flat top, they might say that's not professional. So you get those gendered moments of professionalism, and of course this extends into class and race. Everybody knows this. But what can we do about this, right? Let's look at evolving, right? This moving toward equity, and to be certain that we call this making the road by walking, right? Because we are, trying to figure this out as we go along. So what is workplace equity? It's the attainment of the highest level of workplace health and well-being through systemic fair treatment of all people that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. And what you have to understand about this is that you'll never be done working toward workplace equity because new identities and new ways of being are always going to come into being. So it's a constant process. So if you learn the process, you're on your way. And what I try to explain to people is if you think that culture needs to, stay put and not change, or do you think that culture changes? And in some moments, you don't want culture to be constantly changing. I like the idea, for instance, that when I'm driving on the road, I can pretty much expect that everybody's driving on the same side of the road as I am when we're going in the same direction. That's not a bad thing, right? But when it's used to harm people, like look at the way that race and class and medicine and what is considered sane and what's not considered sane, when you look at all of those subjects and how they've evolved over years, you understand that culture does have to change in some ways. And you have to understand, if it doesn't, who are we protecting and to what end are we protecting those folks? And who is being harmed and to what end are they being harmed? Okay, so setting the sort of stage to continue to talk about being an ally around this too. So a lot of folks have seen the equity versus equality slide that you have in front of you now. And, in the first image, you see the way that fence is, kept, is keeping some folks from seeing over the fence, seeing the game. And so if you're looking at equality, you're making it so that you redistribute those resources so that everybody can see over the fence. And that's where a lot of nonprofit work is done. And we want to say, let's explode that all together and make it so that, everybody can see through that fence completely, and again, that fence is there. That's that cultural norm moment, right? You want to define where the ball field is, but you also want to change so that you can see through it and really look at those systemic barriers that are really keeping a lot of us from experiencing the world in through equity. How should we be an ally? What can we do? To be sure, I want you to know that this is not a one-way ask. A lot of trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary folks also have to, we have to train ourselves, right? We have to figure out how not to rush the folks around us, into immediately accepting everything about who we are, right? And we need to figure out how we can be patient and how to expect accountability, right? And to understand the difference between somebody being really harsh to us at work and then somebody who might have good intentions but doesn't have those harsh feelings toward us. So we're also on the road, trying to train ourselves and trying to understand what we have to do in order to, help bring the world along with us. And sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not. We can't, to be certain, we're not asking TGNC and non-binary folks to carry the full burden of this education, but it is something that we also do. So in your workplace, you can do things to be an ally by, for instance, proactively sharing your pronouns, not waiting for somebody else to ask, right? Especially if you're a cisgender person, to be able to say, hi, my name is Kim, and I use she, her, they, them pronouns, at the start of, say, meetings or when you're meeting new folks. I'd like to talk to people about monitoring the pay scale for equity bias, because oftentimes things show up there, right? You'll see maybe there's bias of one manager toward an employee who's never gotten a raise. You want to provide that education and training for your staff. You want to know the available resources locally and online in case somebody comes to you with a request or a question. You want to honor TGNC and non-binary folks by maybe honoring somebody at an annual event so that you can show your company is behind TGNC and non-binary communities. Support your employee resource group and recognize complexity, right? And try not to make anybody leave any part of themselves, outside of any sort of decision-making process where, that part of their identity is actually relevant to the discussion. And make certain that management is on board with supporting TGNC and non-binary staff. I mean, I can't tell you how many people go to conferences and whatnot, and they're all on board and they're all excited, and then they realize that their management has no intention of making any changes. So really work to try to help management along. Again, going back to language, when you're talking to groups of people, try not to use things like ladies and gentlemen or hey guys or boys and girls did this and that. Instead, try using, the fabulous Southern y'all, right? That wonderfully encompassing, or even saying everyone or folks or they or you, or using, kids, children, or child. This non-gendered language will really help people to come out and feel secure and feel good about the world around them. Your human resources, again, you want to make certain that you are up on the latest trends, but understanding that, yes, there are a lot of moments where federal policy and federal regulations kind of bump up against a workplace regulation or practice. In those moments, you can signal that you still support your employees by saying things like, gender, for instance, in forms like gender as required for EEOC and legal reporting purposes, right? So that says it's not the company that's making this ask, it's the federal government, right? And then try to remove that gendered language from policies and make certain that if you have a dress code, that folks understand that it's not a binary dress code, that it's open to all. So if somebody who may be perceived to be masculine identified, for instance, if they come in a fabulous skirt, that people understand that is that non-binary person, for instance, is fabulous skirt. Convert your signs in your restrooms to all gender. Understand that, for instance, pregnancy isn't solely about women, and update your policies and practices to include a section to support non-binary and trans employees. Super important, because if a trans person comes to you and says, hey, I'm transitioning, or a non-binary person comes and says, I'm going to come out at work as non-binary, you don't want to have to start from scratch and say, great, I have no idea how to support this person, right? If it's put into your policies and procedures manual, for instance, it's going to be clear to you and clear to that employee what the process is going to be to help that person transition into the workplace. And again, you can use your pronoun signatures in your, email. For public-facing parts of your workplace, have your employee resource groups volunteer at local places that serve TGNC and non-binary folks. Donate to organizations that serve TGNC and non-binary communities. Oftentimes, the funding streams out there are very gendered, and they can be difficult to apply to a lot of the TGNC and non-binary communities that we work with. So having those corporate dollars or those individual donations really goes a long way. Sign on to letters of support to these communities. March in your nearest Pride Parade, and sometimes there's even trans Pride Parade, so march in those. Take out an ad in LGBTQ press. That signals that, if when we're reading these, magazines or these newspapers, and to see a company, offer support, we're more, likely to go to those companies because we want to support those companies that support us. And then support TGNC and non-binary staff and interactions with clients. Don't hide them in non-public facing jobs. If, somebody had a very public facing job at work when they were first employed, and then they transition on the job, support them in maintaining those jobs. And lastly, I wanted to let you know about the Equality Act. It's, for information purposes, so that if you want to go out and look for this, what this does is it will actually help to expand existing federal laws to protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in all the categories you see there. And so, this means that, it'll help right the wrongs that are being done in those 21 states, or in those states that have explicit legal protections for trans people, meaning that only 21% have those, or 21 states have those legal protections. So about 2 million trans folks live in the states without these life-saving laws. And so we want to write that, and to really make certain that people can live in states, across the country where those legal protections are in place. And so I've included some resources, especially around, reviewing your dress code or your employee handbook. Out and Equal will do that, and these other organizations have some great resources as well. So thank you very much.